I remember in the not too sort of distant past of Feb 2020, Green Alliance put together a very good conference on COP26, which was of course scheduled to be on now as we speak. It would be an understatement to say much has changed since. COP26 has been deferred by a year. The country faces one of its worst unemployment crisis in a long while. We have a new incoming president in the White House who takes climate change quite seriously. And a prime minister here who does think offshore wind can do a lot more than pull the skin off rice pudding. What hasn't changed, of course, is Green Alliance being able to put on good conferences, virtual or otherwise. So on that note, I want to quickly bring in our panel now, given we've had a slightly delayed start. The issue we're discussing this morning on the opening panel is what has 2020 meant for climate and nature action? We've got three fantastic panelists. We've got Charlie Ogilvie, who's the Director of Strategy at the COP26 unit in the Cabinet Office. We've got Sandrine Dixson-Declève, who's the co-president of Club of Rome, but also holds a variety of several sort of senior advisory positions with businesses and government on climate change. We've got Jessie Nicholls, who is the Strategic Communications Manager for the UK branch of the European Climate Foundation. I know that's a very limited introduction. I will pass it on to the panel so you can introduce yourself. You've got about 2 minutes. I know it's not a lot. Sort of share your opening remarks and I can come back to you with the questions after that. So first up, Charlie.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me and for chairing the session. I'll start just with two quick observations because there's lots of great questions I'm sure that will come in from the audience. And the first is, you know, prior to this role, worked on net zero within government. I was very struck by what an extraordinary coming together there was of civil society, campaigners, NGOs, of course the school kids on the street, and what a strong and powerful ask that was of government, and how that drove the work that we were doing to try and move the net zero target onto the legislative books. I think what characterised that was there was a very single...
Charlie, I'm so sorry. Your audio isn't that great. I'm getting comments as well on the side. They're struggling to hear you. I'm not sure what we can do about this.
Is that a volume? Is that a volume issue or an internet connectivity issue?
I think it's breaking up. It's not a volume issue.
Okay, bear with me.
Yeah.
Why don't you have another panelist speak?
Yes.
I will film my connection.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right. Apologies for that. Thanks so much, Charlie. I'll move on to Sandrine Dixson-Declève.
Yes, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel. And what does 2020 mean for us? And I think in particular, does it really mean action or does it mean a lot of declarations? I think that clearly 2020 has seen the convergence of tipping points between the COVID pandemic, the biodiversity loss, and increasing information around, obviously, the fact that climate emergency is upon us. And as the president of the Club of Rome, having looked at the importance of this convergence of crises, I think that although we are incredibly heartened to see a number of key shifts at the political level, with China now aligning, coming in with the declaration for 2060 in terms of net zero. We see the same with Europe. We see the US joining the ranks now, wanting to come back into the Paris Agreement, and Japan. So we have the big emitters that are now very much making strong commitments. The key is, how do we translate those commitments? And we've seen already within the recovery funds at the European level that although there was a will by the European President von der Leyen to come forward with a link clearly to climate recovery as well as a green recovery, that there's a great deal of pushback. So I would say that although we are seeing at the level of climate huge moves at the political level, the NDCs coming forward, climate emergency declarations. We have 1,840 jurisdictions and 32 countries that have made declarations. We are starting to see a real shift in people thinking that we are in an emergency. But I think the key now is to, and we've seen this in the net zero dialogues and our discussion also at the European level and within the Club of Rome, and what we just heard from the Scottish Minister, that we need to shift to broader than just net zero, moving into a discussion around regenerative, well-being, and systems shifts, because the pressures that we're seeing in terms of the convergence of tipping points are pressures that are systemic and will only continue. So although we can highlight a series of very important declarations, and by the way, on nature as well, Pledge for Nature, 78 countries across the globe and government officials that have indicated that we need to link climate and nature together. We have a series of other pledges that are declaring also the link within the NDCs between nature and climate. We have the WEF report that is allocating 50% of GDP, very much depends on nature. We have more and more companies that are coming forward on nature-based solutions. I think the key here now for 2021 will be translating all of this into clear action plans, as we have also declared in our planetary emergency plan, and targets for action. And I'll close with what's also happened in 2020 is the recognition that we will be closer to 1.5 degrees by 2030. So just setting 2050 targets is not enough. We have to have strong 2030 declarations like the European Commission, but still not enough, moving towards 60%. So these are some of the highlights, lots of movement in terms of declarations, lots of links between the importance of nature and climate, but not moving far enough in terms of core targets and action on the ground.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sandrine. Very, very clear and succinct. I'll come back to you with questions after, but I'll move back to Charlie. Hopefully your internet's back. You are on mute, Charlie, in case...
Oh, hi, is that better?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Sorry, everyone. And anyway, it's always easier not to go first, so I can agree with everything that the previous speaker has said. I'll keep my comments brief, but picking up on a couple of things. Firstly, as I was saying before, when we were all working towards UK net zero, there was one very clear, simple ask to articulate of government. And there was some disagreement around the timeline, but it was very easy to explain to people what we were asking for and what that meant. I think that the real challenge of COP, and I spent a lot of time stroking my chin and working with my team on this question, is what does success look like? How do you articulate success? And of course, and I'm sure we'll come back to this question time and time again, for each different country attending COP, success will look slightly different. They'll have different priorities within the negotiations. For civil society groups attending COP, they would have different priorities. How you articulate the balance between nature and climate, the extent to which you are interested in people and communities versus industrial shifts. COP encompasses the whole of the global political economy, and articulating what a high ambition outcome looks like is extremely difficult and extremely complex, which is why I really welcome this event. And I'm sure over the year, the work that Green Alliance will do in helping to shape up what civil society campaigners' asks are of COP. I think that it's going to be very, very challenging to articulate some really clear landing points. And of course, what can be achieved and what should be achieved will also change as the politics of the year change. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of these themes. The second thing I wanted to add was, 2020 is not over. This morning, Colombia indicated that they would be submitting a significantly enhanced NDC. We have the Paris anniversary event at the end of the year, which we very much put in the diary as a bit of a forcing mechanism on the international system post the US election and other significant external events to drive some of those 2020 commitments out of the system. So I strongly anticipate that we'll see more movement, and I'm very hopeful that we will before the end of 2020, and not least the UK's NDC, which the Prime Minister has said will be released before the event itself. So there's still a fair bit of 2020 to run, and I'm hoping that it's a back-ended momentum shift and sets us up for a really successful 2021.
Charlie, sounds like positive news, which is what we want to hear. Jessie?
Thanks, Chaitanya, and thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to make a few observations on where the British public is on climate and the environment as we come to the end of 2020. So I think it often feels that we're preaching to the choir and that only a very small proportion of the population really sees things as we do. But we all know that we need to go beyond our base if we're going to achieve a broad societal mandate for bold climate action. So we've just launched Britain Talks Climate, which is a project led by Climate Outreach in collaboration with ECF, More in Common and YouGov. And what it does is segment the British population into 7 groups, and it understands how to connect their distinct values and identities with climate change and the environment. And what we see right across the segments is that climate denialism is really disappearing. No matter how old a person is, where they live, what political party they voted for, levels of concern are consistently high, and there is no sign of a culture war that we see affecting other social issues. In fact, acting on climate change is seen as something that can unite us after years of political division. I think, strikingly, climate concern hasn't diminished as a result of COVID-19, and that's because people really seem to believe in the strength of a green economy. A majority see cutting carbon emissions as an opportunity to create new jobs, and they believe that we should use public money to support a green recovery, particularly through investment in low carbon industries at home, even if it costs more in the short term. So overall, I think the message is really clear that policymakers need to catch up with public appetite for action. That said, this consensus is still relatively soft. So when you ask people what comes to mind when they think about climate change, the majority still tend to focus on things like plastics and recycling. They don't realise that how they heat their home, for example, is one of the biggest contributors to UK emissions. I think another example of the softness of that consensus is transport, where the understanding isn't the problem, it's more a challenge of perception. So although most people recognise the need to get polluting vehicles off the road for health and environmental reasons, a significant minority see, for example, the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars as unfair and financially inaccessible. And I think it's really important to say that we could see a real backlash if people feel like they're being ignored or that certain policies are hitting some groups harder than others. So really, just to finish, I think it's clear that choices and trade-offs on the path to net zero are getting harder and harder. If we're going to succeed, we need diverse organisations and leaders all over the country who can mobilise these different identities and values that make up British society.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Someone posted the link to the report in the chat. I'd highly recommend reading it. It makes for a very good read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'll come back to you, Jessie, with more questions. But if Charlie, if you don't mind, I'll go to you next with a couple of questions. The first one is, I suppose, focused primarily on COP26 and the postponement of that, which had to happen, of course. But how do you think that's impacted momentum on climate change and nature across the world? And from your vantage point, sitting in the COP26 unit, what's been the biggest impact on your work over the last few months, and obviously for the coming several months as well?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. So look, the first thing I was really struck by, almost as soon as we started getting our heads around the kind of collective global impacts of the pandemic, how quickly much of the campaigning around climate pivoted towards the green recovery narrative, and there was considerable alignment internationally within voices from civil society, science and business talking about the importance of a green recovery, which was very helpful for the presidency when we were dealing with the uncertainties of the timeline and indeed a political ecosystem that was not hugely interested or receptive to difficult conversations about upping their climate ambitions when they were in really an emergency pandemic management mode. So we used the early part of the year to really pivot some of the core narrative for the presidency and the work and focus we were delivering towards the green recovery. And the COP president and other members of the government spoke internationally on many occasions about the importance of the green recovery. So it sort of created a good galvanizing force in what otherwise could have been a period of, I think, stalemate. What it's given us is this extraordinary vehicle for change. The trillions unlocked through stimulus spend dwarf the amounts of capital public capital that are being mobilized for climate action. And I think it's created a political economy where, very decisive public sector action can deliver huge changes and perhaps given confidence to parts of the political economy that they can intervene to deliver radical change in the face of emergency, although that obviously plays out very differently in different parts of the world. I think that the postponement itself has created a very different geopolitics for us to deliver a COP into. I think it's fair to say that sitting at the start of the year looking at 2020 and delivering a COP kind of now, right? We would have been, if you imagine what's going on over in the US at the moment, we would have had a very curious geopolitics in which to land a high ambition piece of collective agreement. And I think, the movement we've seen in the last 6 weeks, not just from, for example, the China long-term strategy 2060 number, but a slow emergence of more ambitious targets from a whole number of different countries, again, as I said earlier, which I hope will build in towards the end of the year, shows that there has been an unlocking of the kind of energies within the geopolitical system, which now we have to harness into next year. Hopefully, I'm sure we all hope that the impacts of the pandemic day to day will start to diminish as we move through 2021, and focus will come back to this question with the kind of renewed vigor of this geopolitical energy and this confidence about making large interventions from governments into economies. So look, much more is to play for. But somebody said to me right at the start when we were having the conversation about postponing COP, well, if your homework's late, it better be even better than it was going to be before. The global carbon budget has not been significantly impacted by the pandemic. We've lost another year on the pathway to all of those crucial tipping points that we understand in the decades ahead. And so the pressure on what COP26 has to deliver has gone up proportionately as well. And that's the kind of real pressures of what we have to deliver to keep the key temperature goals in sight. But that's also the pressure from civil society to deliver high ambition. So, a lot has changed and it's created a lot of challenge, but it also, dare I say, has created some opportunities as well.
All right. Thanks, Charlie. The conference is aptly titled, I'd say, Making It Count. You're right about sort of presenting our homework a year later. We have to make it count. A quick question to you, and then I'll move on to other colleagues. Some have suggested that COP26 could be seen as like the Olympics for climate. Back in 2012, there was like a strong national spirit of sort of yes, we can in some sense around the Olympics. Could we invigorate that kind of spirit for COP26? Putting aside the specter of another resurgence of COVID, how is your unit thinking perhaps around public engagement? We don't often talk about it, but it's nonetheless an incredible opportunity to engage the public in the lead up to November 2021. How are you thinking about that?
It's a great question, and look, the ambition for precisely that kind of national invigoration of the conversation around climate and engagement is extremely high. Many organisations and businesses are recovering from the pandemic, and therefore we've sort of been careful to have a somewhat soft start to the process. But we launched a few weeks ago the Together for Our Planet campaign, which will be our domestic-facing, wider campaigning brand vehicle for exactly these conversations, with the idea that this is about celebrating climate action happening within communities, individual action, as well as businesses, hoping to elevate that to inspire others and ultimately to help people to understand how these fit into this, quite bewilderingly complicated COP process. And I think it's a huge challenge, as I said in my opening comments. This isn't about focusing lots of groups of different types of stakeholder on one outcome. This is about focusing lots of groups of different types of stakeholder on lots of different quite complex outcomes. Explaining net zero targets is hard enough, and I'm sure work done by many on this call have explored people's actually often quite limited understanding of what net zero means to their day-to-day life. When you start talking about adaptation and resilience and climate finance, the other two pillars of the Paris Agreement, the understanding within wider civil society is really challenging, and we have to create an event which people feel that they can talk about and engage with when some of the questions that will be reported in the kind of green media, the resolution of Article 6, some of these things will seem quite arcane to the man on the street. So look, it's a huge challenge. What are we exciting people about? We can excite them about UK technologies, the UK story, which if you work internationally on this, you'll find that the UK has a phenomenal reputation for its own domestic climate story. Is this about explaining that to the British public? Is this about explaining COP negotiations to the British public? There's a lot that you have to deliver through a campaign like that. So yeah, we are working on it. It's something that we really want to see happening. And honestly, I think the British public is going to look at this vast event in Glasgow, and if we haven't explained to them what it is that we're doing and why it's important, I think some people might be rather resentful of the thing. So I think it's an absolute must-do rather than a nice-to-have.
Thanks, Charlie. And I do hope COP26 unit can lean on a lot of the civil society groups that have been doing this work for a long time, of engaging the public. So hopefully it'll be a collaborative effort. I want to move to Sandrine. A question I have for you, Sandrine, is you've obviously have an international sort of view of the landscape globally on what's happening around climate policy developments. Thing that sort of bugs me, I suppose, worries me, I suppose, is the polarization that we've seen over the last sort of 7-8 years. It's been growing. Geopolitics is always very febrile and tense. Within that climate, how do you think climate and environment action can move forward? The US is in itself a whole world where polarization is quite stark, but relations with the rest of the world aren't great either. So in that context, could you just throw some light on how we sort of cut through that noise and deliver on climate and environment?
Good question. You're right, there's a great deal of tensions, and I think now obviously there's the enhanced economic difficulty and the focus on COVID, which makes it even more difficult to really do what actually the UK should be doing and was done by France before the Paris Agreement, if we're really going to make this the new Olympics of climate negotiations and come out with something that's as substantial and going forward than Paris. And that is the heightened diplomacy that's really needed. I mean, I think what is lacking, and again, I think with COVID it's been difficult, is a heightened diplomatic conversation. And the foreign services of the UK have always been incredibly active in also pushing for climate. For many, many years, working with His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, we worked collectively together to ensure that we got success in Paris. I don't see that happening in the same way that it did pre-Paris. And I think further thought needs to be given to how we unpack these tensions, because we cannot go into Scotland and Glasgow without something that truly proves to governments and people that we are taking this seriously. As I said, moving from the declarations into the action. The other key problem that I see is, and this is building on Jessie's point around diversification, the UK leadership, apologies, Charlie, but this has been criticized. The high-level leadership is predominantly male and not very diverse. And in order to truly bring in also the gender dimension of some of the huge conversations that we need to have around vulnerability, the women are on the forefront with regard to climate, but also in terms of solutions at the community level. I do think that it's a very poor signal coming from the highest ranks in the UK government not to have a more diverse UK leadership in terms of COP. And that does worry me. Now, what else is needed? I think that building on the net zero dialogues that we just had and the race to zero, we need to figure out ways to better link the commitments coming from non-state actors and the commitments from countries. And the UK, again, has been brilliant in trying to bring forward business-led commitments. And we've got so many different pledges, 600 companies that come behind nature and climate. We've got Nature Positive and the new Circular Bioeconomy Alliance that has come forward. And then we have these commitments on banning and phasing out ICEs, as well as so many others in terms of transforming our energy sector. We need to link that up. And we knew that that was a big problem coming out of Paris, that we couldn't quantify what these non-state actor commitments were. We have to get better at doing that. And I'm really calling also on the UK government and partners to work together in order to enable that. I think that will also help unpack some of the tensions with the countries. If we're able to start to share good practice and understand really where we can move the bar in the key sectors around hard to abate sectors such as aviation and transport, but also in particular energy, and truly build a better understanding like we're doing at the Energy Transition Commission, which is one of my roles, but also through the compass that we've just actually put forward by Systemic and the Club of Rome around the European Green Deal that looks at enhancing different policies and also business commitments. So I hope, and I do believe that there are many champions within the UK government and also the champions themselves working with Nigel Topping, who have the broader approach, the systems approach that we need to unlock some of those key tensions that you spoke of. But it needs to be done now and very fast. And we cannot allow the recovery conversations that were supposed to be a green recovery turn back into business as usual, helping out and bailing out the old industries and the incumbents. And that is what's happening now on the ground. We are going to lose many years of action if actually we don't push across countries the very key shift right now and the levers for change through a green and social recovery at this time.
Thanks, Sandrine. There's definitely a lot to unpack there. I suppose a quick follow-up question would be, you mentioned the sort of the Green Deal in Europe, Green New Deal. It was sort of talked about in certain parts of the climate movement. How do you think the UK should, you started talking about it already, but I'm curious if you can speak a bit more on how the UK could or should adopt such an approach, where it's not just looking at climate as a climate issue alone, but the intersecting aspects of the climate change issue. So how it intersects with gender, as you mentioned, with ethnicity perhaps, with other aspects of social policy matters that clearly intersect with climate change and being seen as an entire system. It is complex, of course, and it needs to be seen beyond COP as well, not just something in the lead up to COP. But I'm curious how you think the UK should go about putting such principles into practice.
I mean, it's interesting because the UK has some of the top thinkers, Tim Jackson and also Kate Raworth, who have brought forward donut economics and who are really looking at a little bit what the Green Deal is, which is a systemic approach, new indicators to growth, and a real focus on social, economic, and environmental indicators working together to change our economy to a well-being economy. Scotland is one of the leaders, actually, as a government moving forward in this way. I think the first thing would have been, it would have been great if the UK had stayed actually in the European Union so that you would be automatically part of the European Green Deal. But as that is not the case for the moment, I think that the key is to ensure that a deal type structure, whether it's called a Green Deal or whether it's called a New Deal for British citizens, needs to be put in place, which reflects a much more systemic approach, which optimizes the different policies, which is exactly what the European Green Deal does. And as I said, this new compass that we've been working on does as well, to truly implement the way in which we can enhance transport policy and energy policy at the same time, farm to fork policy and biodiversity policy at the same time, ensure that we look at an integrated approach and the nexus of impacts and tensions that we have. And key to that is the just transition. Key to that is unpacking some of those tensions that Jessie and Charlie also talked about, which is to bring people on board. We need to make them realize they are at the center, but they need to function within the planetary boundaries. And how do we best do that? Let's make sure that they are not continuously penalized by our decisions as we move forward, because politically that's the disaster. That's why we had the Gilets jaunes in Paris, and that's why we've got a broader populist movement that is pushing back on climate. We have to shift taxation policy from labor to products. We need to cost externalities, but not necessarily penalize people. We need to optimize our budgets so that we have no wastage, so that we don't put perverse subsidies first, and instead shift that money into the right green and social programs. We can do this if we are creative, innovative, and have different governance models than what we have today, which create a lot of wastage and bad policies.
Thanks, Sandrine. So much to do, so little time. That's what it feels like sometimes. I want to move to Jessie, and meanwhile, if colleagues at Green Alliance who are sort of looking at the questions, if you don't mind, start sending that to me. I can start posing them to the panel. So Jessie, I'm curious, in light of the recent news around cuts to ODA, it does have implications, if you ask me, on the climate diplomacy matter as well. But based on your research, looking at the way Britain thinks and talks about climate change, what does your research tell about UK's attitude towards its international obligations or moral responsibility? It's a hard thing to communicate. It's not always tangible, but for a lot of us who've been in this sector for a while, there is a sense of like a moral responsibility that developed nations, those that are historic limiters, have in this area, but it's not the easiest to communicate to a lot of people. So what does your research tell, if anything, around the international obligations and moral responsibility of the British government?
Yeah, thanks, Chaitanya. It's a really good question. I mean, to begin with, all the segments, really do understand that tackling climate change requires a global, not just a national response. So I think we've made some progress on that score, but they differ quite a lot in their attitudes towards being part of a global community, if you like. So there's one segment called the progressive activists who, actually lead with their concern about disparate communities around the world. And they talk about the historic responsibility of the UK. There's another segment next door to them called the civic pragmatists. Global inequality and justice isn't a starting point for them, but they are receptive to those arguments. And then for a third, the established liberals, who also take a sort of global outlook, that's connected much more to their sort of professional networks around the world than it is a sense of social solidarity. But they really strongly believe in multilateralism. So I think for all of these groups, Britain's responsibility is relevant. For some segments, they're much more sensitive to this framing, either because they feel our responsibility shouldn't extend beyond Britain, or because they actually feel the weight of obligation should lie with the most polluting countries. That said, even among those segments, there is an implicit expectation that the UK should be performing well on climate and that it should be seeking to develop a good reputation for doing so. So I think, ultimately what this means is it really matters how much we emphasize Britain's role in the world. Some will find this kind of quite an engaging form of communications, but it will be met with skepticism by others.
Got it. Yeah. One of the things that I was reflecting on reading your report was sort of where I see myself in the climate movement. I would call myself a progressive activist, one of the categories that you just spoke of. And consistently throughout your report, you put people like me in the outlier. We're not really in the mainstream in some sense, given the views that we share, even though we think we are sort of holier than thou, though I shouldn't speak for everybody who calls themselves a progressive activist. But in the lead up to COP, you will certainly see a lot of progressive activists really being activated and will be engaging with it quite passionately. But knowing what your research says about where they stand in the spectrum, how do you think they should be working with sort of the rest of the categories you speak of? How do they bring them along and raise the collective ambition of the country?
Thanks, Chaitanya. And yeah, full disclosure, I'm a progressive activist too. But I think, first, it's really important to recognise that the progressive movements have done an extraordinary job, particularly in recent years, in sort of ringing the alarm, and that's reflected in where we see public opinion today. But we know that a lot of the hard work is still ahead of us, and we can't assume that more of the same will continue to open up political space. So as we look ahead to, the high levels of unemployment that you mentioned at the start, a huge amount of pressure on costs, I think the progressive movement will need to position itself very carefully. And there are some insights within Britain Talks Climate that I can kind of share in terms of a kind of advice. I think number one, develop asks that integrate social and economic priorities. And this doesn't mean reining in ambition. I think it means crafting, campaigns and policies that we can actually win, and putting the voices and lived realities of ordinary people in the front and center. I think number two, laying the groundwork in areas that are not yet part of the policy debate. So, for example, shipping and the global footprint of banks, so that we're in a position to take advantage of the political situation when space begins to open up. And I think importantly, number three, like Sandrine mentioned it already, but it's so important to bring others along with us. I think, as you say, progressive activists are an outlier on many of these issues. So empathizing with starting points on climate other than our own and making it easier for people to participate will speed up rather than slow down the transformation that we so desperately want to see.
Thanks, Jessie. Let's hope we can do that once we get out of our Twitter bubbles. I want to move to James from Green Alliance, who's probably sitting with a bunch of questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Chaitanya. And thanks to everyone who has submitted questions into the Q&A box. We've had some really fantastic questions on a range of topics, from carbon pricing and low carbon diets to public opinions on climate change. To kick us off, the highest upvoted question is from Rebecca Wrigley from Rewilding Britain. Rebecca quite rightly points out that green recovery plans are orientated the economy towards green energy and transport, but land and marine management sectors, which can make huge contributions through nature-based solutions, are under-recognized and under-resourced. What do the panelists think about this, and how can the case for nature-based solutions be made to government?
I can go ahead. Yeah, I think that's a fabulous question. I was just looking at it and seeing if I wanted to answer directly, but I think that there need to be clear pledges by governments right now. Chile has done exactly that, actually. It's in its NDC, where it's really linked climate and nature together. We know that the feedback loops are there. We see now also through the WEF report that in terms of risk management, nature and climate are always at the top. So what we're seeing is that businesses now are truly putting pressure on governments to bring in the nature quotient and to look at nature-based solutions. I think the only key issue that we need to be cognizant of is how we start to look at these nature-based solutions, one in terms of regenerative propensities and obviously the offsetting options, the way in which we use forestry and land use, and then how we use the shift of some of these materials, such as nature-based materials, and some of the key impacts that we may have actually on nature, which are detrimental, as we saw with biofuels policy, bioenergy policy now, pellets, bringing in whole trees, etc. So there's a real balance, and I think the key issue, and we see this with the work that we've been trying to do with Vivid Economics and Nature for Climate, is the fact that we need to quantify, first of all, the positive impacts, obviously, in nature, and then how do we actually quantify the potential impact of enhanced nature-based solutions and nature-based materials. And that we do not have a proper quantification, in particular in the way in which we use land. So the optimization of land, greater resilience accounting, all of this needs to be done as we move forward. But there is a huge move in that direction. There are conversations that are ongoing, I'm the chair of the resilience track of the UN Food Systems Summit, and this is one of the key conversations that we're having right now. So I'm hopeful that by COP26, we can really integrate some key principles into how we link nature, rewilding thinking, regenerative agriculture with our targets for COP.
Thank you, Sandrine. James, any further questions?
Yeah, a question which has caught my eye is from Hannah Dillon, and this question is posed to Jessie, but Charlie and Sandrine, I'm sure, can chip in and add some more sort of political context to it. Hannah asks, do you think that once the raw economic realities of COVID-19 hit, that public support for action on climate change might run dry, especially if action involves further restrictions on the way we live? And what are the ways through this?
Thanks, James, and thanks, Hannah. I think the support will be there if policies align with other priorities. So, you know, things like high quality employment that is secure, and crucially, if those policies are perceived to be fair. I think people do understand that, you know, green agenda can equal green opportunity, but the policies need to be designed in a way that kind of fits with and is sympathetic to their lived reality. On the idea of kind of further restrictions and just harking back to that point around nature, I think across society, you know, we value the countryside and nature almost more than anything else. It's the thing we're most proud of after the NHS. And lockdown has really reinforced that connection and prompted a kind of change in behaviour in terms of our appreciation of nature, buying local seasonal food, supporting local businesses. So I think, you know, the desire is there.
Anybody else on the panel wants to? Yeah, Charlie.
I just briefly hop in. Look, this is a sort of tangential to COP strategy, but my observation is that people respond to outcomes much more than they respond to policy. So picking up on some of Jessie's comments, you know, if people can see that this agenda is delivering for them a preservation of beautiful nature and countryside, if they can find that they can run their car cheaper and cleaner, these are outcomes, they're not policies. You put a 2030 phase out date in, you put a 2040 phase out date in. How people feel about that is going to be reasonably superficial. It's how these things end up impacting their lives. And I think what we have is a responsibility, not just to argue over targets, but also to make sure that when this policy is delivered, it brings people along in a fair way. People understand the changes that are being made to their lives, and they feel that those changes are positive. And I think this whole agenda, from nature through to industrial climate action, has a huge potential to make a very positive impact on people's lives. That it feels right now that the hard bit is arguing about 2030 climate targets, NDCs, you know, outcomes in negotiations. The really hard bit is getting that policy delivered in a way that people continue to buy into it, and it makes a positive impact in all of their lives and their communities. And ultimately, that's how you win this argument. You can't do it on a Zoom panel ahead of actually going and getting your hands dirty.
Thanks, Charlie. Very interesting insight. Could we take one final question from the audience?
Yeah, question from Dustin Benton. Dustin asks, diet change is a major opportunity to free up land for nature and carbon removal. Do you think the new salience of food since COVID-19 creates new space for action on eating lower carbon diets?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is part of the work that's being done in the UN right now in terms of the new Food Systems Summit preparations. The conversations that we've had with EAT, FOLU, all of the major organizations, coalitions that are looking at dietary change is very much demonstrating that. But I think the key is that we both need to look at the shift of diets, but we need to look at the access to food, and we need to look at the decrease of waste. So it's the full value chain approach, and it's also that resilience conversation that we need to make sure we have, which means that just because we have resilient crops, which by the way, we know is not good for resilient soil, is a big issue. So we need to get really deep into what does healthy food mean for healthy people, and how do we actually shift the kind of consciousness that we have right now around access to food, access to water, access to healthcare, which is the kind of post-COVID consciousness, into a real change in diet, a real change in behavior and habits of our consumers. And this is the moment. I think tapping into that consciousness is the moment. That is one of the opportunities, not to sail on the back of the hardship of people who are suffering from COVID, but instead understand that most people, as they sit in their homes, are mostly now thinking about the most essential parts of their lives. That is also the key systems shift that we can tap into as we move into COP26. And we have to do that as a collective community in working with governments so that they really do make a difference and think about this and not go back to business as usual.
Thanks so much, Sandrine, and hi, Dustin. I'm going to use my privilege to just have one final question for Charlie, as the strategic director of COP26 unit. This is a typical question I tend to ask, which is sort of crystal ball question. If you move to Jan 2022, yes, and sort of open the newspaper, the Telegraph says COP26 is a resounding success. And COP26 unit has done a tremendous job. In hindsight, what would you say you've done? 3 things you'd say you've done really well that led to that headline in the Telegraph.
So I think, thank you. It's a good question, and again, one I spend a lot of time thinking about. So at the very headline level, I think we have to deliver a set of negotiations that achieve a consensus outcome, that move forward the 30 or 40 significant mandates that the presidency has to deliver. That is core business for running a negotiation, which sits around at the heart of all the other activity. And I think if you fail to do that, you really call into question the credibility that you've run a successful COP. Obviously, within that, there are issues around finishing the Paris rule book, around Article 6, common timeframes, etc. That many of you will, I'm sure, know a huge amount about, and others will come to become sick of over the next 12 months. Look, I think the next thing is to show that the Paris Agreement is delivering. Now, that's about the 5-year ratchet since Paris. That's countries having arrived at COP with enhanced 2030 targets, enhanced long-term targets. And that's really looking at, are we closing the gap to those temperature goals? Is this agreement working? Has the UK presidency done its bit through its diplomatic network, which I can assure Sandrine is straining at every seam to deliver, and hopefully that delivery will pick up. But can we credibly claim that these temperature goals are in sight? But I think around all of that is a question of balance. Paris is not just about mitigation. It's not just about carbon budgets. It's about adaptation and resilience. It's about acknowledging that we have 1 degree of warming already in the system, that this is having a huge impact on livelihoods and communities around the world, and that we have a responsibility to provide a framework for managing those climate impacts and supporting those countries and communities, and that the COP is the place to solve some of those problems and to move that conversation forward so it's fit for purpose for the next 10 years. I think that's hugely important. Climate finance is part of that, but also sits within the mitigation space, and we also have to ensure that we are developing and enhancing the delivery of climate finance, seeing through the £100 billion target that was agreed in Copenhagen, and setting again up the conversations on how climate finance will flow for the next 10 years. I think there are other balances. There's a balance between voices from the global north, people who are excited about technology acceleration, about sector transitions, people who want to come and talk about carbon capture and storage, want to talk about hydrogen, want to talk about EV in heavy industry, EV in heavy goods vehicles. They want to talk about all of this tech-driven stuff. And then there are voices from the global south who maybe want to talk about resilient agriculture. They want to talk about water scarcity. They want to talk about all the other issues that climate impacts on. So there's a huge question of kind of balance that sits around all of those things. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting balance as a presidency of what are the kind of headline high ambition outcomes that people will point to. But around that, the challenge for me is to make sure that this event, which will cater to a vastly wide range of different stakeholder voices and concerns, is seen to be balanced and fair and accessible and inclusive. And I think that actually that's really the heart of the challenge. And that means that on one level, we have to run a safe, inclusive event. Physically, we have to be excellent hosts, excellent guests to our hosts in Glasgow. But that also means that at a time when it still may be hard for some parts of the world to travel, we can show that we are inclusive to some of the quietest but most hard-hit voices across this whole agenda.
Excellent. All right. Thanks so much, Charlie. All I can say is good luck. It is a tough gig, but also a great opportunity to sort of showcase leadership. With Chris coming on video, it's a sign that I have to jump off. It's the end of the panel. There was a request to ask a question of each panelist, but I'm afraid we totally have run out of time, and it's not fair on the next panel. So thank you everyone, Charlie, Jessie and Sandrine, for taking the time. And I certainly found it insightful. I hope the audience did too. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chaitanya.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's Chris Venables here again. I'm head of politics at Green Alliance, your compare for the day. I will now be taking a couple of minutes break. The next panel on leadership for a sustainable economy will start at 10:15, so in 3 minutes time. So hopefully that's enough time to run to the kettle. But just to say thank you again to Chaitanya, to Jessie, to Sandrine and Charlie for a fascinating discussion on 2020 and the challenges and the opportunities ahead in 2021.